Okay, so this week's topic, we're moving into looking at some specifics about a project that I was involved in with colleagues David Ferrugia and Julia Coffey in particular, about the hospitality industry. So we're going to break this up as usual into three parts. I'm going to look at the first part where we're going to talk about the aspects of vibes and bar work and young people and working in this kind of effective labour space. Part two, talk specifically about class and taste and gentrification. And in part three, take a little bit of a detour to bring in another project that we did in the middle of COVID, in terms of what happened to particular international students who were working in the hospitality industry and the overt inequalities that they were facing. So for part one, we're lucky enough to be joined by David Ferrugia. Hi, Dave.
Hello.
And so, yeah, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Sure. Yeah. I am a sociologist who specializes in youth, especially in its relationship to work in different ways. And I have been working this topic from a range of different angles. I've been looking at the relationship between youth identity and work in terms of how young people become workers over the course of their lives. And I'm also interested in the way that youth identities are constructed at work itself within the labor process. And that's what drew me to eventually come to look at hospitality workers. Yeah.
Yeah. So the project we're talking about here was happening kind of in parallel with other work you were doing on young people and work that we'll talk about in another part of the course. But yeah, tell us a little bit, for instance, here about like why hospo is a good
Mm.
place to think about these kind of different changes to the labour market and how this affects young people and why they're kind of in higher numbers, I suppose, working in a place like hospo than other sectors or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there, but look, hospitality is a ubiquitous form of work. I mean, we all interact with hospitality workers quite often daily. And the thing with hospitality is that we take it for granted as part of the landscape of our life, but it is connected with a really specific set of relationships between identity and work, as you know, I argue, and as we kind of discovered as we did the work, right?
Yeah.
So it's also taken for granted as young people's work. In fact, youth are critical sources of value for contemporary capitalist societies in general. The labor of young workers has been absolutely critical to the expansion of the service economy, which is a labor intensive form of work, right? You have to have workers. That's what the service economy is. And youth labor is concentrated in the most precarious and poorly paid parts of the labor market, including these kinds of interactive service work occupations, hospitality and leisure services, as you say there. These are key sectors. Lots of people work in them. They are normatively now considered young people's work. And working of this kind is considered a normative experience for young
Yeah.
people. So even though it's not taken very seriously as a kind of work for youth. It's seen as something you'll do for a while, and then maybe down the track you'll do something else. It is critical. Young people's participation in the sector is critical to our urban economies.
Yeah, yeah. It's like not considered a real job, even though there's literally hundreds of thousands of them. Um, it's seen as unskilled, even though we know that there's so many skills involved. From a kind of more structural position, young people in this job often have like what I would call legislated discrimination on them, and they get paid less than the kind of general population. So it kind of has all these kind of structural, effective kind of life course things all kind of coming together in this space. So it's an interesting place to be looking through this kind of stuff. So
Mm.
what we're interested in this, in relation to that, is the actual practice of labour. What's going on in these spaces, and it's not just about pouring drinks, is it? It's about more this kind of relational stuff that happens in these spaces. Hospo is not
Mm.
just selling you a beer or a cake or a meal; it's selling you an experience and a feeling, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we're interested in this project, the practice of labour. So I believe you've talked in other parts of the course about youth transitions, which is interested in origins and destinations. It's not actually so interested in what people do while they're at work, right? And that's obviously very important. So not only that, the interesting thing about the hospitality industry is that it's seen as kind of not serious work. It's not the kind of thing that you would ask yourself, well, what does a hospitality worker actually do at work? So we're asking a new kind of a question. Um, but as well as that, as you've kind of alluded to, hospitality is not just about handing over a beer or a piece of cake or whatever. I mean, if you think about the things you consume at a hospitality venue, quite often you could get them for a quarter of the price at a shop 200 meters away, take them home and consume them. But you would have a very different experience doing that, right? And what hospitality venues offer is that experience. And the reason that interactive service work is labor intensive, as I mentioned before, can't just be automated, is that that experience is a relational experience. It is something that emerges between people in a concept of interaction, in a process of interaction. And these concepts that you've got on the slide here are in different ways trying to grapple with that. So a number of people have, oh, here we go. Yeah. So you've got a few kind of examples of this. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
I can.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, so we've kind of in a little bit in the course so far. I just kind of flagged that these notions of labour are important concepts throughout the course. I suppose rather than go through them individually, we're focused more on the immaterial and effective labour. So can you tell us a little bit, I suppose, why those concepts are useful for thinking about what we're looking at here?
Yeah, sure. So the concept of immaterial and effective labor speak to forms of work in which the product is intangible in some ways or immaterial. Okay, and there's a whole series of examples of this. Arguably, service labor across the economy, including professional services like accounting and things, are immaterial labor. Advertising, you know. So what's produced is a cultural symbol, an idea, an aesthetic, something like that. Effective labor is quite interesting though, because effective labor looks at the production of sensations. It looks at feelings, right? And initially, I was drawn to this concept as a way of thinking about hospitality work, to think about what that experience that hospitality venues offers people is. But you can think about affect in all sorts of different ways. So say you go to a party and you think, oh, the vibes here are off. This is awkward. This is not a good space. You know, sometimes parties, they just don't have it. They don't come together to make a fun. That's affect at play. That's a feeling that you're having in your body that is experienced as the outcome of your involvement in a set of relations that might be going well for you or might not be going so well. And what I'm kind of trying to argue is that hospitality venues are in some ways very similar, where what's produced is a sensation, ideally, if you enjoy yourself, a sensation of leisure, of enjoyment, of relaxation, of conviviality. So what's on offer in a venue is not just, you know, a cup of coffee or whatever, but that affect. And so effective labor speaks to that. It kind of says work is something that takes place in a relational way, and in the process, it produces sensations. And the last thing to say about that is that effective labor also produces subjectivities, identities, right? So in a service encounter, you interact with someone who's performing and, in a sense, constructing an identity with you. You know, there's banter from them, there's banter from you. Perhaps there isn't if you're a bit awkward, whichever it is. But the feeling of consumption is produced through the relational performance of identities. So on the one hand, we have sensations. On the other hand, we have subjectivities or identities. Yeah.
And the interactions between those things. Yeah, that's right. So, and I think one of the things we knew we were going to find in a way in this project, and we did, but there was some interesting aspects of it that we're going to talk about throughout this content, is that you know, your example before about the vibe, feeling good or bad or awkward in a space. So if you go to a party, like that's kind of a thing. If you go, venues are actually trying to make a particular vibe, a particular through aesthetics, through their tastes and all that kind of stuff. So in that sense, the effects are sometimes about including some people and not including others. So we'll look at that in some detail in the second part of the lecture today. But what's important here in terms of the effective labor is that it's blurring here lines between production, consumption, work and leisure, kind of self and product, where the worker in the space kind of brings their whole self and it's kind of what's working beyond pouring the beer or serving the thing. Of course, their presence, their taste, the way that they look is part of that aspect of creating a vibe in a hospo venue.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. When I was considering the idea of this project, um, I was younger and still going out a bit more than I do these days. But one of the things that I was kind of building on was the fact that if you go to certain hospitality venues, the workers all really look like they fit in the venue. Okay,
Yeah, and a
and
good
this
place
is
with a good
especially
vibe that works they do. Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
No, that's right, exactly. So, and when I was doing my PhD, I was living in Melbourne, and Melbourne has a number of music venues which are quite famous within the city, and the workers that work at these venues are really on brand for the venue. Okay, so what's happening there is that it really matters that for venues like that the workers look the part. Okay, if you're a pub that plays a lot of heavy guitar music, then you need people behind the bar who look the part,
Yeah.
right?
They
So
look like they could be in the
looking
bands. Yeah.
well, often they are. That's the
Yeah, that's
thing,
right.
right?
Yeah.
So and somebody looks the part most effectively when it's how they dress all the time anyway.
Yeah.
So if you have a worker that looks the part naturally, because that's the kind of scene that they move in their social life, that's of massive value for a venue. But it's not compensated. You don't get paid extra because you're cool. You get
Yeah.
paid the same as everyone else in the industry. So there's a real, that bringing the self to work thing has a very particular meaning in the hospitality industry.
Yeah, and we started to kind of theorize this around this idea of creating a vibe,
Yeah.
relating it here to an effect. Like venues are going to create effects. We kind of like, and the reason we use vibe is it just kept coming up all the time in our interviews. People started just using that term, like, and importantly here, like Greg says, again that kind of unskilled idea in
Mm,
in some ways that anyone can pull a beer, but being a
mm,
good bartender is about creating a vibe, contributing to that
mm.
effective atmosphere of the place.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So he says, a chimp can pull a beer. And what he's really saying there is that the product of his work, he's kind of saying what I sort of said before in terms of theories of effective labor. He's saying the product of my work is not the poured beer. The product of my work is the vibe. And
yeah,
the workers really saw it as their task to make these vibes happen. And
yeah.
he describes it, the indescribable something that makes something what it is, the moment of enjoyment. It's creating those moments of enjoyment that they saw as being their jobs,
Yeah,
right? Mm,
yeah. And that often like really kind of describe moments when it was going well and the crowd was going off and that made them feel good and like a happy fit in person behind the bar increases
mm,
the conviviality of the whole thing and everyone kind of benefits in that kind of sense. And so
that's
that
right.
importantly vibe is relational. They talked a lot, didn't they, about like intensities and energies and that kind of
Yeah,
thing. Both in
they
when things go good, but also when they go bad.
that's right. So they talked a lot about needing to give off a particular energy behind the bar to contribute to the air of enjoyment within a venue. But they also talked about the fact that that was easier when the crowd was vibing.
Yeah.
So this is kind of what theories of effective labor are trying to talk about when they say it's a relational accomplishment. Okay, that's not to say that the people behind the bar aren't working because of course they are. Okay, they don't forget that they're at work. Okay, but the energy of the crowd, the energy of the bar person are all complicit in the creation of this affect of enjoyment within a venue. And and well, yeah, here you go. Yeah, so if that is in place, then it facilitates the labor process.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that a lot of hospitality workers they'll use this phrase, getting slammed. Okay, and getting slammed just means where you're so busy you don't have a second to do anything. But if you're getting slammed, but the vibe is there, it facilitates the labor process. Okay, so obviously you're not having the same experience as the person you're serving drinks to, but there is something that's shared there, and that sharing is so key to the way that venues operate and actually extract value. Because let's not forget that this is work that is producing massive profits with very low wages.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
another thing they spoke about too, when they're getting slammed, like, yeah, the vibe thing and the flow, like if everyone behind the bar is working in a particular way and cooperating, it helps, right? And um, often when that wasn't the case, things get broken, and then it kind of destroys the vibe of the whole thing, and everyone comes down
Mm,
then. So there's a kind of really interesting relation there between that kind of stuff. Yeah.
that's
So we,
right.
we
Yeah,
also
that's right.
found, like, and you've kind of touched upon this already, the relationship between this kind of stuff and consumer taste. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're going to talk about this a little bit more later on as well. But um, one of the things that was quite important for some of our participants was that the venues that they worked in were venues that they personally identified with, and ideally venues that they would consider consuming at. If you work somewhere that you would consider consuming at, you are more able to participate in that kind of shared vibe, right? And you are also more naturally capable of the kinds of relational performances that facilitate the vibe in one place or another. So when that fit was there, and it wasn't for plenty of workers, but when it is there, it teaches us something about work and about effective labor, which is that when it feels natural, it can feel spontaneous, and that's where you really get those moments of enjoyment that are shared between worker and consumer. So we've got a guy here who talked about this, where he basically said, if everything fits together, if the bands that are playing in my venue are the kinds of bands that I know about, I'm likely to, if I don't know the people there, they'll be kind of my people. And
Yep.
it feels, as he says here, it feels more like a community. People aren't rubbing up the wrong way. So there's a feeling of togetherness and of alignment. And what's interesting here is that it's shared between the consumers and the workers. And when you said earlier, the lines between production and consumption are blurred here, that's what that kind of refers to. The fact that, in a sense, part of what this person's talking about in terms of having a good time at work is he's positioning himself in some ways as a consumer, as part of the scene, not just as an employee. But of course, he is an employee and he has to serve them drinks, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
there's a real tension going on here, and effective labor is interesting because of that, because there's so many tensions going on in the identifications that people make with work, but those tensions are all key to the production of these feelings of enjoyment.
Yeah. And I've spoken earlier in the course around punk scenes and stuff like that, around the kind of the blurriness between those boundaries as well. And so, okay,
Absolutely. Yeah.
moving on. So, yeah, can you tell us a little bit about here, like more about that kind of blurriness?
Yeah, sure, sure. So one of the things about hospitality work, and we talked about it earlier in terms of work that isn't seen as kind of serious work or real work, is that hospitality work resembles leisure in some ways. So we had workers talking about how in order to facilitate that vibe and keep people having fun when they came to get a drink and whatnot, they would do things behind the bar. So if the bar staff look like they're having fun with each other, then the patrons like that. They feel like we're all having fun together kind of thing. So they might dance with one another, they might sing or just chat or just interact in a way that was kind of fun. Okay. Um, you know, they would occasionally maybe have a drink together behind the bar and everyone would go, well, hey, look at them go. Right.
Yep.
So this is work that in some ways resembles leisure. But of course, we're not suggesting here that this is not work. What we're suggesting here is that it's a form of work that that brings a person's subjectivity to work in a really particular way. So effective or immaterial labor encompasses a person's whole embodied subjectivity. There's a sense in which there is no aspect of the self that isn't somehow made relevant to the process of value creation. Your personal aesthetics, the way that you talk, your relational styles, whether you're a bouncy person or more of a kind of, you talk in a more kind of monotone way or whatever, the way that you hold your body, the way that you make eye contact with people, your whole self in that moment is relevant. It's not just
Yep.
one sort of capacity of yourself. So your capacity for relating to others, which is basic to human subjectivity, it's something that unites all of us that we want to relate to others, is brought to work and exploited. And young people are also able to do this work, partially because they have experience of it as consumers, right? So there's very little training in the hospitality industry, right? How do you know how to be? Well, if your tastes align with the venue that you're working at, then you'll have a sense of what's expected. And you've been to venues in the past, you kind of understand how they work. So as you say here, a clear distinction between people as producers and as consumers is much more complicated. It's not like I make a, whatever sprocket and I hand it to you, and so now you own it. And I made this material thing, and all that matters for me in that moment is my capacity to make sprockets, right? Actually, what matters in that moment is a very expansive, aspects of myself there, and
Yeah.
we negotiate that together.
Yeah, and one of those kind of cause the blurriness, it's then not seen as a real job, right? Because it's fun and all this kind of stuff. But like really large aspects of the job are not fun. They're like, kicking out dickheads, cleaning up spew, going to pick glasses, getting crap all over you, getting dirty,
Having people
sweaty.
be rude to
Uh,
you.
People be rude to you in those interactions, let alone the kind of
Mm,
intensity of being slammed and all that kind of stuff. So that
mm,
we talk a little bit about that. So to kind of get towards the end of this section, I suppose one of the things we kind of also discovered is not just the kind of poor working conditions that are kind of well understood, but there's negative health effects.
mm.
People that work in the industry for a long time, have to kind of be the party, and that has all kinds of issues when it comes to like drinking and not eating correctly and all that kind of stuff. But I suppose one of the interesting things that happens is as people get older, the enjoyment of the party is kind of okay at first, but it gets old pretty quickly. The party kind of develops in a way that, like, as you get older, you don't really want to party anymore. You just want to have a job and be able to go home and relax and all that kind of thing. So we had some interesting um, examples, didn't we? Where like it was actually hard to get out of the hospitality industry for some, particularly those that maybe like had structural conditions in their lives, like they couldn't continue at the uni and ended up having to work more, look after people, all this kind of stuff, where they end up becoming what they refer to themselves as lifers, wasn't there?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's the same slang term that's used for people who are in prison for
Yep.
their life.
Yeah.
Yeah, so look, hospitality is popularly regarded as kind of transient labor that you'll do for a few years. And the lifers in our project are never intended to become lifers when they got
Yeah.
into the industry. But it can be very difficult to leave hospitality if you'd like to. I mean, this is a good example here. So this was someone that we interviewed. She was one of the oldest participants when we first started the project. She'd been working in hospitality for about 15 years. She was almost 30. And she had tried to leave hospitality a number of times. Problem with it is that she worked in a bar with a late night license, and it was not unusual for her to finish work at 4 a.m. And that means you're out of sync with everything. It's very
Yeah.
difficult to study. She had tried to start studying a couple of times and it hadn't worked out. And she said, I'm getting tired. I'm tired of the late nights. I'm tired of trying to have to create this vibe. I don't think she was very interested in doing that anymore. She started to feel a bit burnt out. But what she also said is that she feels like she wanted to move on with her life and she couldn't. She felt behind others who had achieved things that perhaps she might have wanted to do at some point in her life and hadn't because of the precarity, the low wages, and the very unsociable hours that she had been working. So there's a sense
Not
in
having
which
any support beyond that to be able to kind of move out of that trajectory. Yeah.
no, yeah, I mean, she's casual, so you can't take leave, or
Yeah.
if you've got an exam or something like that, you just don't get paid. Yeah, so in a
She couldn't
sense,
live
she
at home with
felt
her parents, couldn't live at home with the parents, all that kind of material stuff, right? She has to support herself without
exactly.
any external support. It becomes a kind of thing a trajectory that you're kind of trapped in. It's really hard to jump
You
off.
get stuck. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of contrasts a little bit to the guy that we spoke to, for instance, that was now like, remember him, he was working in some kind of governmental department, but also worked in hospitality for years. He even went over to New York for work for a while. And then he sometimes on the weekend, despite having a full-time job, would do what's kind of rock star shifts where places he used to work at, he would just go and work at them because he enjoyed it. But he enjoyed the social side of it, didn't he? He liked being able to kind of
That's
get
right.
people on the help his mates out and
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a rock star is called a rock star because you get called in at the last minute because somebody's got sick or whatever. You don't have to do any cleaning up or anything like that. You come in, you work, and you leave. He likes doing rock stars because he got to participate in that atmosphere of enjoyment for a little while, which he liked.
Yeah.
You can get your mates into the club. You seem a bit cool in that kind of moment. And also when it's almost like a hobby for you there, you
Yeah.
know that you don't have to do this next weekend if you don't want to. So
Yeah. So the other thing
he gets
he did 2 degrees to prolong his ability to work in the hospitality industry.
he did two master's
It
degrees,
sense the
which
privilege
is
there, right? Yeah.
absolutely very confident that he'll be okay long term in his life, and he was. actually,
Yeah.
because he came out of the hospitality industry with two master's degrees, has a full-time professional job, does the odd rock star, and so it's a very different biographical narrative than the narrative from the participant before, who
Yeah.
talked about constantly feeling stuck and trying to leave hospitality and not being able to. And it also shows how diverse the hospitality labor force is. You have people from working class backgrounds, middle class backgrounds, students, full-time, part-time, migrants, all
Yeah.
working together. But then
Yeah.
their pathways, especially towards the end of their time in hospitality, really reflect the resources that they bring to the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. And I'll unpack some of that kind of class aspects in the next section. So yeah, thanks for joining us here, Dave. I'll finish this recording there.
All right, thanks for having me.